Well, folks, spoilers ahead. If you just watched the newest episode of the Santa Claus's Show on Disney Plus, you know that we just received the most Bernard content that we have gotten since 2002. So in reality, this entire review is basically a Bernard watch because we finally get to watch Bernard on the big screen, or technically the little screen, because it's a TV show. And because of that, I'm going to be changing the structure of this review a little bit. I'm only going to be addressing the nice, which is the stuff I like in the show, and the naughty, the stuff I don't like in the show, because I'm going to be talking about Bernard throughout the entire review. You're welcome. So why don't we start off with the nice. The first 12 minutes of this episode of the Santa Clauses is the best Santa Claus content we have gotten in this entire franchise since the original Santa Claus movie. This is the first time in this entire franchise that we have really explored the lore of the Santa Claus. And it turns out it was just bogus the whole time. If you watch this episode, you now know that Scott Calvin is not only the first, but the only human to ever be Santa Claus. It turns out that all the other past Santas have been ethereal beings, and Scott Calvin was basically the chosen one, like Anakin in the Phantom Menace, and he was chosen to be the first human Santa Claus. And this right here is a great example of creating a retcon that vastly improves your franchise. With this information and with this retcon, there are so many moments in the Santa Claus franchise that make so much more sense now. For example, all the elves that show up in the real world in the first Santa Claus movie that just are there, they were legitimately scouting out Scott Calvin. That's why they were there. The reason the clauses are so weird and super specific is because they were literally tests for Scott Calvin. And Bernard being annoyed with Scott Calvin in the first movie makes so much more sense now. He literally got this idea just thrown on him, and he was probably just like, what the heck, guys? I'm going to have to do all the work. I'm going to have to train this dude up to be Santa Claus, and he's just a human. I would imagine those first few years of Scott Calvin as Santa, Bernard was basically Santa Claus. He probably did all of the work because, Scott, no offense to you, you're just a dumb human. That's what you are. You don't have the power or the ability to be Santa Claus because you're not an ethereal being. So I imagine Bernard did all of the work during that time. So Bernard was essentially Santa during those first few years. Obviously, Scott, later on, you did a great job as Santa, but those first few years, I imagine it was basically just Bernard being Santa, which let's go ahead and confirm those first few years of Scott Calvin Santa Claus was probably Bernard as Santa. I mean, we can go ahead and confirm that. End of tangent. Just wanted to get that all out. And speaking of Bernard, who better to reveal all this information to Scott than Bernard himself? Bernard was incredible in this episode. He was just perfect. And you have to give credit to David Krumholtz. He has not played Bernard in 20 years. 20 years, and he was still throwing his fastball. And the best part about this performance is that he came back and played Bernard completely the same. He didn't try to change things up or do anything different. He literally played the Bernard that we all know from 1994. The amount of skill and range it takes to play the exact same character as both a kid and an adult is so impressive. Because this isn't the same as a child actor coming back and playing the adult version of themselves. David Krumholtz is literally playing the exact same version of Bernard. He may look older, but he's the same Bernard. I honestly think the cast of this show has been pretty great, but pound for pound, David Krumholtz is by far the most talented and best actor of this entire cast, and I don't even think it's close. He carries every scene he's in, but he's been doing that for 30 years. So it's not that surprising. If you haven't gotten a chance to watch David Krumholtz's work post Santa Claus, I would strongly recommend it. He has a small role in the movie Hail Caesar, but he's so good in it. And also it's a Coen Brothers movie, so it's a ton of fun. And he's also going to be in the new Christopher Nolan movie Oppenheimer, and that movie looks like it's going to blow us away, if you catch my drift. Anyway, back to Bernard. Obviously, the biggest question we had about Bernard going into this show is why wasn't he in Santa Claus 3, which was a question that I posed back in April and also a question people have been asking for years. So where has Bernard been? Well, I'm sorry to break this to you, and you probably already know at this point, but Bernard is no longer an eligible bachelor. No, stop your booing. Stop. Stop booing. Stop. 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 Stop booing. Stop. Stop. Jeez. That's right. Bernard gave up his eternal youth to marry Oscar winner Vanessa Redgrave. And whoever changed Vanessa Redgrave's Wikipedia to say that she was married to Bernard the Elf now, oh, perfect. Beautiful job. It's no longer up. It makes me really sad. But whoever did that, you are my hero. So Bernard robbed the cradle and married someone nearly 1,500 years younger than him. Hey, I respect it, as long as he's happy. And while I would have preferred for him to give up his eternal youth to be Santa, the whole Santa Claus was a sham, so it was never going to happen to begin with. Or maybe he could be Santa in the next episode? I mean, he's not technically an elf anymore. I mean, he's aging. I don't know. Never say never. You just have to understand that I am going to die on the Bernard should be Santa hill. That is where I have planted my flag. I'm not leaving. Some other Bernard moments that I really enjoyed in this episode. I loved his banter back and forth with Scott. It is just so nice to see these two argue like an old married couple again. Oh, it's just the best. And his final speech to all of the Santas and to Scott was the perfect amount of sass and sincere that we all expect from Bernard. Overall, it was just a really heartwarming moment, especially when he gave Scott a hug before he left. Oh, it just tugged at the heartstrings. And it makes me really sad that this will probably be the last time we see these two on screen together as these characters, obviously. But just like Scott and Charlie's conversation at the beginning of this season, this was the perfect bow to put on this relationship, and it gave us closure. And finally, the last thing I really loved about this episode was all the past Santas showing up. This whole Yuleverse, or whatever you want to call it, was so much fun and something that I genuinely did not think this show would dive into, so I was so excited to see it. And also Jim O'Hare, who you might know from Parks and Rec as Gary Terry Jerry, plays the 17th Santa, and he is just the perfect casting for Santa. Honestly, I would love a spin-off series just about him being Santa, because I imagine he was the perfect Santa. Now, before I get to the naughty segment of this review, I need to address some questions that I had after this episode about the clauses. Obviously, in this episode, we found out that all of the clauses were basically tests for Scott Calvin, which is totally fine. The Santa Claus is pretty weird, but at least you get kind of a fun gig from it. The Mrs. Claus is by far the worst clause. It is essentially selling your soul to Santa. We already addressed this in the last video, but it is the worst clause. And then the escape clause. What was the plan for the escape clause? Was Jack Frost in on all of this from the beginning because he's also like an ethereal character? And were the ethereal Santas also just cool with Jack Frost becoming Santa? And also, did Scott have to initiate the escape clause at some point to literally pass this test? And finally, did Curtis know about any of this? And while I might not have an answer for the first two questions, I do have an answer for the third one. The answer is no. Curtis didn't know about any of this. I guarantee it. And if you don't believe me, from what I understand, Bernard was head elf for thousands of years, literally since the beginning with St. Nicholas. So how long was Curtis head elf? Like 10 years maybe? How long is that in elf time? Like 10 minutes? So this has led me to believe that Scott's biggest test as Santa was having to endure Curtis as head elf. I have come to that conclusion. That was his biggest test. It just makes too much sense. And I imagine appointing Curtis to head elf and screwing over Scott in the process brought Bernard so much joy. All right, now that I've addressed the nice in this episode, and there were plenty more things that I really enjoyed and really liked in this episode, but we need to move on. Let's go ahead and talk about the naughty. If I'm being totally honest, I wasn't a huge fan of this episode after the first 12 minutes, which was the whole Yuleverse segment. It just felt really rushed, and everything that had been established up to this point just felt like it was kind of being pushed to the side, which on one hand really sucks because we have established a lot in the first 4 episodes. But on the other hand, after those first 12 minutes, I wasn't anywhere near as interested in the characters we've been watching in the last 4 episodes. I'm just a little nervous that this show might have peaked too soon and the finale might feel a little anticlimactic now. but I also might be totally wrong, and I really hope I am. I'm not the biggest fan of Cal and Sandra taking up the mantle of Santa. Obviously, I'm the biggest Bernard Should Be Santa fan in the entire world, but I'm going to stay optimistic because I want to see where they go with it. Overall, I really enjoyed this episode, and I'm excited to see where the finale goes. But that's all I got. Thank you so much for watching this review. If you could leave it a like, I would really appreciate it. And if you're not already subscribed, press the subscribe button on your mobile device by using your finger, or if you are on a desktop, use your mouse to click the subscribe button, or if you're using a laptop, use the little trackpad to go up and press the subscribe button. I'm giving you all the different ways to hit subscribe just in case you do not know how to do it. If all goes well, I'm really hoping to do a live reaction of the finale of this show. So if you want to hit your bell notifications just so you know when I go live, that will probably be the best way to find out. And also I probably will premiere that video so it will show up in your sub box. But I would love for you to join me for the live feed. And if you're not able to, you can go back and watch it and just listen to my dumb commentary about the finale. But for right now, I'm going to go watch the first 12 minutes of this episode 100 more times, and I will see you for episode 6, aka the finale.